Okay, now sections 3 and 4 of chapter 24, hybrid zones. So, excuse me, where you have two species coming into proximity with each other, you have the potential for them to form hybrids. And so here's an example in Europe of these two toads of the same genus, Bombina, and you can see the habitats. The fire-bellied is more to the east and the yellow-bellied is more to the west and south. And where they come together, you have this hybrid zone. And so they do hybridize, but the hybrids seem to stick to the zone and don't spread and form a third species. So it appears that these are indeed two distinct species, but yet where they come together they form hybrids. You can see in terms of this specific form of this gene. In the yellow there's a very high frequency of this, and in the fire-belly there's a very low frequency, and then of course a significant gradient between the two species through the hybrids. Now when you get hybrids forming between two species, so this graphic is supposed to show a single species that then diverges into two separate species over time. You have a hybrid zone that forms between them, and there's sort of different outcomes you can get. So under this one, what's called reinforcement, the difference between the two species is reinforced because hybrids tend not to last. They sort of die out. Other times you can imagine where you might get fusion, that is the two different species, because they're closely related enough, when they do hybridize, it tends to just kind of merge back into one species. Or you can have a situation in which there's stability, that is, hybrids persist, but the distinct original species also persist. So that stability is probably what we have going up here, where you do get the formation of the hybrids, but the separate distinct species persist. So now here's another example of reinforcement, and it has to do with these Pied Pipers, I think is what these birds are called. And so when the two, remember we talked about sympatric and allopatric before, when the two species are sympatric, that is they're in the same area, the males look a lot different from each other, and so that tends to reinforce the species difference and the reproduction between them, such that the females, as you can see, only mate with males of their kind. However, if you have situations where these two species are allopatric, that is they're separated from each other. Now of course when they're separated the females just mate with their kind, but if the females are given the option of mating with the other type of male, the males under these situations don't look all that different from each other, and so the females with a relatively high frequency will mate with the other species. That is, the species barrier breaks down. But again, out in nature you might say they're allopatric, so they tend not to get together. So this is sort of, at least with the sympatric, that difference reinforces the reproductive barrier between these species. Here's an example in some cichlids. Cichlids are a relatively diverse group of fish, and the tilapia in our classroom are an example of cichlids. And here are these two different species. In certain habitats, that is where the environment is different, the water is more turbid, it's essentially less clear, the species tend to hybridize. That is, they really can't tell the difference from each other, you might say, and they form these viable hybrids where, at least under those conditions, the two species tend to fuse together into just one single species. Okay. So, now, finally, the rate of speciation. How quickly does it happen? Well, our good friend Darwin envisioned speciation as this gradual process. That is, two species would gradually, over time, become more and more differentiated such that you would ultimately end up with two different species. And that indeed can happen. However, more recent work, in particular by these two guys, these two paleontologists, the folks that study the fossil record, and in looking at the fossil record, what they saw is that for some species, you didn't necessarily see this gradual change. That is, when you look at the change in the fossils, it seemed to be a pretty abrupt change. And for both of these graphs, by the way, as we go this way, we're progressing in time. That is, at least in the geological history, they tended to differentiate or speciate very quickly. And here's another way of looking at this. So under the Darwinian gradualist model, again, you get the divergence, and then the species sort of slowly change over time. But with this punctuated situation, what they call punctuated equilibrium, is that species tend to spend most of their time not changing all that much, but then due presumably to some significant, short, relatively quick change in their environment, they differentiate a great deal and speciate and then proceed on as they are. And so the rate at which that speciation process occurs is much more rapid in the punctuated equilibrium model. Now, which is correct? Well, it depends on the group of organisms. There are definitely examples of gradual change in the fossil record, but then also examples of very quick change in the fossil record. So we really see both. Here is an example of speciation. This is a type of sunflower. It's called Helianthus anomalus. You can gather from this part of the name that this species was somewhat of an anomaly. They didn't know what it was all about. Well, this guy named Loren Riesberg in his lab, they investigated this, and they thought that anomalus was potentially the hybrid between two different species. Here, Helianthus anus and Helianthus petiolaris. So what they did was they attempted to recreate this hybridization event. So they hybridized Annuus and petiolaris. And so they generated this hybrid. And what they found was that in the first generation, the hybrids were not terribly fertile, but those that they did get to successfully reproduce over subsequent generation, fertility increased. And so essentially the hybrid was sort of, you might say, purging itself of some of its deleterious genetic combinations, if you will, and evolving into something that was much more fertile. And so what they did was, after they had this relatively fertile hybrid they had created, they compared it to the real anomalous, and what they found was what they had generated experimentally was very similar to what existed out there in nature. And so they take this as pretty strong evidence that indeed this anomalous is a hybrid between these two other species. And so presumably at one time anomalous didn't exist, but then Annuus and petiolaris gave rise to it. So essentially, you might say, evolution in action, essentially seeing the process of evolution occurring. Okay, that's it for macroevolution.